to welcome Tom McEnteer, who's going to talk about significant people from Tioga County that maybe we know about, maybe we don't. Thank you.
Well, I imagine everybody will be able to hear me even without a microphone. And this kind of got started, quite a long time ago when I discovered that there were some people from Tioga County that did some pretty big things around the country. So I started a list, and originally it was going to be 25 famous Tiogans. Well, it got bigger than that, then it became 40, then 50, and I'm still working at it, and I occasionally find another name to add to the list. By occasionally, I mean like almost every month I find another name that needs to be on the list. I've got 76 names so far, and no sign of it slowing down anytime soon. Now, the unfortunate thing is that my sources of information, for the most part, have come from outside the borders of Tioga County. Our local history books mention some of these people, but not all of them. So that's why the original title of tonight's presentation was Stuff You Didn't Know About People You Never Heard of. And I had a ball finding out stuff like that. Now, some of the information, what I'm going to do, I just, for my sake, my notes are, if I get it right side up, my notes are for the most part pictures. I look at the picture and I think, oh, I know who that is, and then I'll talk about them a little bit. By the way, this is my list of names here that keeps on growing, and after I get through, I'll spread these pictures out up here, so if you want to see what some of these people look like, and you can browse at them and say, oh, he was a handsome dude, or what an ugly face. I'll leave that up to you. In any case, some of the people, the names you'll recognize immediately, because some of them just aren't that well known. And on some of those, not all of them, but some of those I may have some interesting little tidbits that we didn't already know. I just realized I got my back to the camera over there. Poor Lars is trying to take my picture and I've got my back to it. Let me do it this way. All right, if you go back in time a little bit, probably the most recognizable name there is of a Tioga County person or a person connected to Tioga County would probably be John D. Rockefeller. I think of all the people that have a connection to Tioga County, he's probably the one, wherever you go, people are going to recognize the name. So I don't need to tell you much about him. He was born up in Richmond, and he got his education, such as it was, down here in Owego, where he was primarily raised. And that was pretty much the last education he got. When the family moved out of Owego, I don't think he had graduated yet, but they moved out to Ohio, and of course, one of the reasons the family had always moved around a lot, and part of that was because of John D.'s father. Well, he was the kind of fellow that just wasn't welcome in very many communities for very long. And so the family moved a lot to keep a few steps ahead of the law. Anyway, out in Ohio, of course, John D. eventually became the first American billionaire. Well, one of the little secrets that maybe you don't know, some stuff that you don't know, is that we know that John D. became the oil baron of the United States. At one time, he pretty much controlled the entire oil industry in the country. Of course, one of the products of that oil industry was gasoline. And at the time, John D. was getting the oil industry off the ground and running it. there wasn't much of a market for gasoline. He sold a lot of oil, he sold a lot of kerosene, but gasoline, there wasn't much of a market. Well, around that time, the automobile industry was coming into existence. And of course, the automobile industry in its foundation, when they were just getting started, you had cars that were powered by gasoline. You had cars that were powered by steam. You've all heard of the Stanley steamer, the White steamer, and so on. And you also had cars that were powered by electricity. Studebaker Company was a pioneer. They made electric cars back in the very early 1900s. And as a matter of fact, the Champion Wagon Company made electric trucks right in Owego. And it was the most successful product that they made. Unfortunately, they had one big customer that bought them and then kind of died out at that. There was one other form of engine for the automobile. Henry Ford, originally, the first cars he made were designed to run not on electricity, steam, or gasoline, but alcohol. Alcohol, specifically from grain, corn, other things like that. And that's what Henry Ford wanted cars to run on. John D. Rockefeller was not going to have it. He used his money, his power, his influence, his lobbying of the government to basically get rid of that idea and force the automobile industry to burn his product, the gasoline. So now, of course, one of the things that is a big topic of conversation, we're talking about electric cars and so on, but even a few years ago, they started talking about, and we have added, I guess some people call it gasohol to vehicles, corn-made alcohol added to the gasoline as an additive to create less pollution in the air, because alcohol burns an awful lot cleaner than gasoline. And so you can thank John D. for polluting the air of this country for the last 120 years or so, because it was John D. that forced Henry Ford, the largest car maker in the world for a long time, to not burn alcohol, which farmers, every farmer could have grown it, but John D. wasn't making any money on what farmers were growing. So that's just a little, maybe something, a piece of stuff you didn't know about somebody that you very definitely have heard of with John D. Okay, probably the next biggest name in Tioga County history that at least the last few years people have talked about is Belleville Lockwood. She has been a huge topic of conversation the last few years around here. People especially have gotten, interested in promoting women, and so they've been looking around for women. And why there was even a bit of a movement here about 2 years ago to rename the Owego Post Office for Belleville Lockwood, calling it the Belleville Lockwood Post Office in Owego. Well, the thing that you probably did already know, but maybe not, is that Belleville Lockwood never lived in Tioga County. Ever. She visited here once, but the woman that was here in Tioga County that ran a school for girls for 3 years was Belva McNall, not Belleville Lockwood. She was a young widow. Her original husband, Uriah McNall, she was married to him only for a few years, for about 5 years, and he died quite young. So she was a young widow with a daughter, actually she taught school in a lot of places. Probably 5 different communities in New York State have just as big a claim to Belva as we do in Tioga County. Well, she did get here, she did own a school here, she wasn't just running it, she owned it and operated it for about 3 years, from about 63, 64, 65, and then she left and went down to Washington, D.C., where she ended up furthering her education, and she met a man named Ezekiel Lockwood. He was a lot older than her, but he was a very persuasive preacher, and they got married down there. And that's where the name Lockwood comes in. But that was 3 years after she left Owego permanently. The only other time she came here as Belva Lockwood was for a very short visit for a couple of days when she was the guest of honor at the 1909 Old Home Days in Owego. By the way, the Belva Lockwood Inn was not built until 1878, so it was more than 10 years after Belva left there. The school that she taught in was partially dismantled. It was moved over to a site near where the museum is today along the riverbank, and it was used as a carriage house. And it was there until the 1930s when it was torn down, and it's gone now. But in any case, at the property where it stood is, we now have the Belva Lockwood Inn in honor of a woman that never lived here under that name. So, we'll add Belva to the pile of people with pictures up here. If I ask people in candor, who is the most famous personage you can think of that has anything to do with candor, I'm guessing, you probably think of this guy, although you don't recognize him by this picture, you might recognize him by this one. Lewis Hardin, Moondog, is probably a name that just about anybody that's been in Candor for any length of time, and I assume that includes all present company, have heard of Moondog. And I think you probably know as much about Moondog as anybody does, and I'm not going to try to tell you anything new, original, or secretive about Moondog. Here in Owego, they called him Moondog. His actual name was Lewis Hardin. He wasn't born blind, but he was blinded when he was quite young. And he, in New York City, he used to hang out in New York City looking like this. And down in New York City, his nickname was the Viking of 6th Avenue. And he went to New York City to record music. And the Columbia Record Company actually recorded quite a pile of his music, a number of albums. And he was a very accomplished musician, which was kind of unique for a blind man. When he left Candor and New York City, he went back and forth between the two. He was pretty adept at finding his way around for a blind guy. But he ended up moving to Germany, and he lived in Germany the rest of his life, and that's where he died. But yeah, you don't recognize him from that picture. I don't think he ever looked like that when he was living in Candor.
When did he leave Candor?
Somewhere, I think in maybe the late 80s. I'm not sure.
Middle 80s.
Middle 80s?
He lived up past us. He used to walk down that road, Brink Road, and cross the main highway and hitchhike to New York City.
Well, hitchhike to New York City or hitchhike down to Owego and take the bus.
Whatever, but I mean, I'm surprised he could make it across that road.
I remember sitting at Joe Charles's gas station in Hubbardtown.
There you go. By the way, this is exactly what I want people to do. If you either have a question or a comment, this is an informal thing. I'm not one of those people that stands on ceremony. Feel free to just shout it out. I'm easy.
Oh, one more thing on him too.
Yeah.
Like 74, when we went up to Brink Road, and our kids were young then, the boys what, was it Dan that saw him? He was coming down the road anyway, he was robed in his horns, I had him on, he was, turned the corner there, come down Brink Road, and he did come running in the house. And so this crazy man coming down the road did.
Scared him to death.
Scared him to death.
Ah, that's cool. Another name that should be familiar to people from here in Candor, and I hope, anyway, the historians will know the name, and probably a lot of the rest have heard it too. Does the name George Kinney ring a bell with anybody? George Kinney, another Candor person, probably the most successful businessman ever to come out of Candor. And that was because he was making up for his dad. His dad ran a grocery store in Candor, and his dad was a wonderful guy that loved everybody and just couldn't say no. So he let people get their groceries and say, well, you know, I'll try to catch up to you and pay you some money next week. And eventually that kind of caught up to him, and his dad ended up owing more money himself than he had and went out of business. So George decided that that was never going to happen to him. He was always going to have a job. Well, at age 17, he left Candor and went to Binghamton and got a job at a shoe factory. And then he moved from the shoe factory to a clerk in the shoe store over in Binghamton. The Leicestershire Boot and Shoe Company. That was one of the ancestors of Endicott Johnson, of course. So anyway, he worked there for a while and it paid off his father's debt with the money that he earned as a clerk in the shoe store in Binghamton. Then, as he got a little older, he took over the management of a shoe store. And then he took over another shoe store, and another one, and another one, and another one. And it went on from there. He had retail shoe stores. The first one was in Waverly. And then from there he went Corning, Wilkes-Barre, Binghamton, Ithaca, Reading, Pennsylvania. Soon he had 15 stores. He moved to Manhattan, and the chain exploded from there. And pretty soon he was the head of the largest retail shoe operation in the entire United States. Kinney Shoe. Unfortunately, what happens over a period of time, of course, shoes aren't made in this country anymore. They're made all over the world, but finding shoes that are actually manufactured in the United States is a real challenge. And so Kinney Shoes, the last little vestige of it that still existed was an outfit known as Foot Locker. And there were a few Foot Locker stores around. I don't know if they still exist or if even they're gone now. But I remember there had been a Foot Locker over at the Oakdale Mall quite a few years ago. But the Oakdale Mall itself is not really there anymore. So anyway, one of the pictures here is one of George Kinney's first shoe stores. We've got his picture on one side and one of his first shoe stores with the name on it on the back side.
Wasn't there a Kinney Shoe Store on Lake Street? Yeah, that's what I was thinking. There was the Kinney Shoe Store on Lake Street.
Yeah, for a little while. Yeah, that was one of the last ones that he opened. One of the things that he did throughout his entire career, whenever he opened a new store, he always wanted to have them managed by somebody that he knew and trusted personally. And he hired an awful lot of people from Candor to run his stores, even though they were far away.
Tom, I thought I also read someplace once upon a time that he became ultimately the last owner of Endicott Johnson, like maybe when they, went into receivership or whatever.
I honestly don't know, but that's an interesting fact to see if it's true.
Yeah.
But I truly do not know. Don't know that one. Another local name, and again, just to make sure that you guys are aware that we're not forgetting the ladies here. We picked on Belvalacqua a little bit, but when it came to government, not quite from Candor, but just up the road here in Spencer, we've got Esther Hobart Morris. That's a name that I suspect you've all heard of. She considered Spencer her hometown, but this lady holds the distinction of being the very first woman in the United States to be elected to public office. She was a justice of the peace way out in Wyoming. And to this very day, there is a statue of Esther Morris right out in front of the state capitol building of the state of Wyoming. So she is recognized, and again, they made a reproduction of that statue and sent it down to the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. That's something that was done relatively recently. So that's not a bad thing, but a little bit of information that maybe you didn't know is that she has been honored in by the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. They have a smaller version of the exact same statue that's out in front of the state capitol.
I think she appointed herself judge and then was elected after.
That could well be.
Her husband was the judge, and when he passed away, she appointed herself to.
Good for her. But she did get elected, and she was the first one to actually be elected. Here's a name that everybody's going to know, and I'm not going to talk about her because a lot of you know her personally and know her family, and I think she's even been here to give a talk. So I'm just going to leave it at that and say, you go, girl. She was great. We had some of her uniforms in our museum down in Owego when we did our military exhibit honoring the 100th anniversary of the first Veterans Day.
I can't see that far, Tom. Who was that?
Becky Halsted.
Oh, yeah, Becky Halsted.
Thank you.
Yeah. And while we're on the military, not from Candor, but from Tioga County, one of Owego's who fell into fame quite accidentally. And that is Corporal Margaret Hastings of the Women's Army Corps during World War II when she was aboard a plane as a sightseer, just a tourist, and at an air base in New Guinea, and they took off and flew around to show some of the nurses and other members of the WACs, just kind of giving them a tour. And to get some flying hours in, the plane crashed. There were only, of all the people on the plane, there were only 3 survivors, and they were stranded in a jungle. The jungle was not uninhabited, and of course the famous story is that these people that were in that jungle had never seen anybody that wasn't a member of their own tribe before. So it was quite a shock to them when from out of the sky, God delivered them an angel or whatever. And of course that story is well written about and well talked about. We had a couple of people to the museum in Owego a few years back, and they had a couple. There have been books written about her, and of course she wrote her own book, her serialized many chapters of her own adventures. And some guys came, and I think they were affiliated with the History Channel, and they were going to make a movie about her. But that was about 5, 6, 7 years ago, and I never heard any more about it. So I guess they decided the story was just not exciting enough to make it into a movie. So no movie about Margaret. And of course, another name, probably everybody here would immediately recognize, and of all the people that I'm going to mention, this is probably the one who is most recently achieving a level of fame that goes way beyond the borders of Tioga County. And that's Doug Hurley, an Appalachian boy. Graduated OFA 1982, was the last man to fly the space shuttle, and the first man to fly the SpaceX, which is currently the replacement vehicle. So Doug had a first and a last there, giving him his claim to fame. One of the things that I discovered a while back, in 2019, we did an exhibit at the museum in Owego of the honoring the 50th anniversary of the moon landing. And I recalled that when I was hired in 1966 to come up to teach in Owego, there were a group of us that had come up and all got hired together. And I had to call the school district a couple of weeks after they hired me to say, look, I'm not going to be able to take the job after all. I got my notice from the selective service that I had been drafted, and I won't be coming to teach. I will be going to Vietnam. And the school district at the time, I don't remember who it was that was in charge of personnel at the time. I think it was a man named Skip Tioga. Lars, you would remember, was he the personnel
I believe so.
director in 1966?
Dwayne Fielder.
What? Dwayne Field.
Dwayne, yeah,
Well, everybody called him Skip.
right.
That was his nickname. Even the teachers called him that. Well, anyway, he said, "Oh, don't worry about that." Well, he said, "We'll take care of that. You don't give it a second thought. You're still hired. You're still coming up. You're going to work here." And I hung up the phone and I thought, wait a minute. Why does some little town up in the middle of godforsaken nowhere have so much clout that they can tell the military who they can and can't draft? Well, a little while later I found out. Probably the most secure military facility on planet Earth was right here in Owego, New York. And the people that worked there had kids, and those kids needed teachers. And Owego had a lot of clout as a result. And we really tried to promote the fact during the space exhibit that we did at the museum back in 2019 that every manned space mission in American history, if there was a computer affiliated with that mission, that computer was made in Owego, New York. And that is, as far as I know, as far as NASA is concerned, that's still true. The stuff that NASA built is still, including some of their ambitious projects, the Orion project, and some of them that are destined for maybe Mars or God knows where. Lockheed Martin is still picked up where IBM left off, and they're still involved in some of that. Plus, in addition, a lot of the American fighter planes and all of our helicopters and a lot of other military equipment was made right here in Owego, as far as computers were concerned. So, yeah, Owego had a lot of clout, even in 1966. They were already working on computers for the space program in '66. Most of us didn't know it, but yeah, they were. Of course, another name that everybody would recognize, and that's Tom Platt, the U.S. Senator from Owego. This is a picture of him when he was a fairly young man. He was involved, he had fingers in every pie when he was younger. His family had a drugstore, he worked for the railroads, he was involved with American Express, and he was a United States Senator. He was supposedly the most powerful man in the Senate. And I looked it up, and as far as legislation was concerned, he didn't do anything. He never wrote a single bill that passed the Congress. But he claimed, and not unjustifiably, that he personally handpicked 4 presidents of the United States. Unfortunately, the last one was a boo-boo on his part. He decided that he didn't like Teddy Roosevelt, who was governor of New York. And he wanted to get Teddy the heck out of his hair. So let's get this guy out of New York. And so he convinced William McKinley to take on Teddy as his vice president. Well, that didn't work out so well for Tom Platt because McKinley got shot in Buffalo and Teddy became president. And that pretty much spelled the end of Tom Platt's power. But while we're on politics, Tioga County did produce a senator and a cabinet member, Secretary of the Navy, Ben Tracy, but we have never produced a governor of New York State from Tioga County. However, we produced 3 people who did become governors. 2 of them became governors of Michigan. Austin Blair and Woodbridge Ferris became governors of the state of Michigan. Now, what's the connection? Do we go to Michigan? Well, actually, for whatever reason, an awful lot of people that settled in Owego decided that they didn't want to stay here. They moved on. And they went west, and one of the favorite places, God knows why, to go to if you moved on from settling here in Owego was Michigan. And we had quite a few people. The man that wrote the first history of Tioga County, Charles B. Avery, the guy who was one of the very first attorneys here in the county, he was the one that had Susanna Loft in his house as guest and held her funeral there a couple of days later. And he wrote a magnificent history of the early Tioga County. Then he packed everything up and moved to Michigan. We had to get some of that history from Michigan to bring it back here. Well, anyway, these 2 guys were both governors of Michigan. Now, this fellow here, Woodbridge Ferris, he comes a little closer to home because he was from right up the road here.
He taught in school, too.
He did indeed. He went to school here, didn't like it. He was from Halsey Valley, and he didn't like the Candor schools. He found a way to get into the academy down at Owego. And he graduated from the academy at Owego. How he pulled that off, I'm not sure. I think that actually, before graduating, he actually found a way, because in those days, getting to be a teacher was pretty much anybody that wanted to, that knew more or was a little older than the kids they were going to teach. So he taught in Candor for a little while to earn enough money to go to the Owego Academy. He did so well at the Owego Academy that Cornell wanted him. Cornell University said, "We'll take you. You don't have to take any admissions tests. You don't have to do any, just show up." He decided he didn't want to go to Cornell because Cornell did not offer courses in how to be a teacher. So instead of going to Cornell, he went to Oswego and got his degree in teaching. That's one of the little things that I'm sure, in looking back in Cornell's history, that's one little episode they probably would rather sweep under the carpet. Somebody picked Oswego over Cornell. But at the time, Cornell didn't have courses in how to teach. And again, it's kind of unique because in politics, everybody that's in politics, it seems, for the most part, they are either very successful businessmen or lawyers that aren't making enough money being lawyers. So that's where most of our politicians come from. You don't run into many that get to be not only a governor, but after he was governor, he became a United States Senator from Michigan, and he was a school teacher. He wasn't a big businessman, and he was not a lawyer. He was a school teacher. And that was his life. He was a school teacher. And he became governor and senator from the state of Michigan, which is pretty cool, as well as pretty rare. We had another governor. And this fellow, he was actually from Binghamton, but he was a lawyer. And he became a lawyer and passed the bar because he apprenticed with lawyers here in Owego. You didn't go to law school in those days, you apprenticed yourself to somebody that was an established law firm. And so Gilbert Carlton Walker he finished his law work and got his legal diploma here in Owego. Well, not here in Owego, we're in Canada, but here in Tioga County. And he eventually went down, and this is kind of interesting because he became governor of Virginia in 1869 as a Republican. In 1870, he decided he didn't want to be a Republican anymore, and he changed his party affiliation to Democrat. And they kept him. That was fine. So he served 4 years as governor, 2 as a Republican, 2 as a Democrat, no problems or issues, which is kind of unique. All right, now, we've pretty well covered a lot of the people that you probably may have heard of because they were significant enough. Now I'm going to get to some names that maybe you've heard of and maybe you haven't. These are the, now it's going to be stuff you didn't know about, people you haven't, maybe don't know about, but they still had some big accomplishments. Okay, here's a simple question for you. This will be followed as I go along with some other people, asking some more little questions like, who invented, got the first patent for the folding chair?
Stackmore.
Nope. Good guess. Good guess. Because Roscoe Geller probably has more patents for folding chairs than any other person in American history. But the Geller family didn't start Stackmore. There was somebody else before them. From Berkshire, there was a fellow by the name of Calvin Buffington. And the Buffington Chair Company, sometimes known as the Confidence Chair Company, and when they moved down to Owego and sold out to the Geller family, it became Stackmore. But I don't have a picture of Calvin Buffington, but that's the first folding chair, patented in 1912. Now, if you go on Google and ask the question, who invented the folding chair, you're not going to see this. Because according to Google, the first folding chair patent issued was something like 1934. Well, even the Geller family had patents on folding chairs before that. But Cal Buffington, 1912. More than 20 years before the first one listed in, at Google. And this was originally intended to be an extra little jump seat for your wagon or your Model T. Something, and it does fold up. And this, examples of this chair are actually in several museums of engineering and design all over the world. There's a very famous museum of engineering and design in Germany. They've got one of these chairs. And they are also in several other museums around this country. And so the first folding chair that really worked and really existed came out of Berkshire, Tioga County, New York, Calvin Buffington. This guy you probably heard of because we talk about him a lot. But as far as patents go, this guy was a real winner. Andrew Burgess. Recognize the name? Some of you must.
He was gun patents, right?
Yep. He was the man. He earned beautiful careers in two totally different fields. He started as a photographer working for Matthew Brady. Now there's a name you've all heard. As a matter of fact, when Matthew Brady went bankrupt, one of his employees, Andrew Burgess, took over, bought the company and ran it for a few years, and then decided he was tired of photography, sold it back to Matthew Brady, and moved on. But this man was hired by the United States government to travel the world, taking official photographs for the government. He was in Mexico, he was in Italy, he was in other places in Europe. Then in 1871, he decided he was done with photography, came to Owego, married a young woman here, and started what had been a hobby, became his passion, and that was improving firearms. And Andrew Burgess holds kind of a record. He has the second largest amount of firearms patents, period. The only man that has more patents related to firearms than Andrew Burgess is a fellow named Browning, known for the Browning automatic rifle. Of course, Browning made his gun. Burgess sold all of his patents as soon as he registered them. He sold them to everybody. He sold them to Remington. He sold them to Winchester. He sold them to Colt. He sold them to anybody else that had the money to buy them. One time he decided, you know, I'm going to try making guns myself. And he took a patent for a folding shotgun. And he manufactured them. He bought a factory up in Buffalo, and he manufactured a few shotguns up there. Well, actually, quite a few. He actually got some pretty good contracts. He got a contract from the New York City Police Department to make folding shotguns for the New York City Police Department. By the way, the Commissioner of Police in New York City that gave Burgess that contract was a fellow whose name perhaps you have heard somewhere along the line, Teddy Roosevelt. There is a wonderful story that Burgess's salesman walked into Teddy's office as police commissioner and yanked out of a little pocket inside of his overcoat a folding shotgun, snapped it together, and fired 7 shots, blanks, over Teddy's head into the ceiling. They were blanks. Well, to give you an idea of the character of Teddy Roosevelt, he responded not by calling for help or climbing under his desk or screaming in panic. He jumped over the desk, grabbed the shotgun and said, "Mir, this is wonderful! I want one of these!" And that's how Burgess got the order for something like about 1,000 of them that they sold to the New York City Police Department. It was because Teddy fell in love with the gun the minute he saw it. So, anyway, that's that little story. How am I doing? If you get tired and think, gee whiz, you know, I'd like to get home by the weekend. Let me know. Another inventor that we had here in Tioga County, and this was a toy inventor, a fellow by the name of Charles Crandall. And Charles Crandall loved toys, quite by accident. His father was a box maker, wooden boxes. And the kind of boxes that the corners fit together, you know, like that. And he had some scraps left over, he took them home, and his kids fell in love with them. They were building all kinds of stuff using these little scraps from the ends of boxes and building all kinds of stuff. So that was in Montrose. So he thought, wow, maybe I should try to market these this way. And he did. It was very successful. So he moved up to Waverly, Tioga County, and built a factory and started making toys. And one of the things that all of his toys had in common, they all involved some kind of a joint that fit together like this. And he made figures with separate arms and legs that could be posed and all that. He made acrobats. And then he decided he would try something completely different. And he invented the dexterity puzzle. Now, a dexterity puzzle is those things where you wiggle them around, try to get the balls into the holes and so on. That was created and invented in Waverly by Charlie Crandall. He was the first one. And I wrote a story about that a while back, and I may have even talked about it here once when I talked about toys. But that toy was so popular, it was the first toy in world history to sell 1 million units. first toy to sell 1 million units. And Crandall couldn't keep up with that kind of demand, so he hired about 10 other companies to help make them, to be able to produce enough to meet the demand. So he had the patent and he made the toys, but he also had a lot of other companies making the toys as well, just to try to keep up the demand. So, of course, dexterity puzzles have been popular in all shapes and sizes ever since, but that was about the first one. That's the original patent documentation. Supposedly, some United States senators got started playing the game on the Senate floor, and it spread, and so many people got involved with it that the Senate had to call itself to a halt, and they'd send the pages out to buy more of the games to bring them in, and they spent the whole afternoon at the Senate playing games. Probably more constructive use of their time than a lot of them do now, but anyway. Another article that I wrote for the Courier here not too long ago was that there must be something in the water over in Flemingville, because maybe, I think there's a little paint got mixed into the water in Flemingville, because Flemingville is the arts capital of Tioga County. There have been 3 or 4 painters that achieved quite a level of significance that came out of Flemingville. One of them was Thomas LeClaire, who went on to paint the portraits of 2 United States presidents hanging in Washington, D.C. There are a lot of people, a lot of artists painted a portrait of a president, but LeClaire has 2 presidential portraits down there, which is, that's pretty unusual. I don't know if he's the only one that has 2 portraits hanging in the, presidential portraits hanging in the gallery, but I think he might be. Another artist that came out of Flemingville, and the 2 families lived across the creek from each other, because right in the middle of Flemingville as the creek comes down, Cataton Creek, and the other fellow, and no, this is not him. The other fellow's name was Henry Cross. Henry didn't like Flemingville. That's where he was born and raised, but he didn't like it there. By the time he was 15 years old, he'd run away from home twice to join the circus. You know, you always hear stories about so-and-so ran away and joined the circus. Well, Henry Cross did. He ran away from home before he was 15 years old and joined the circus. Twice, they brought him back and he ran away again. Well, before he was 16, how he accomplished this is beyond me. But this was back in about 1850 or so, the very early 1850s. He ran away from home again. This time, he said, they're not going to bring me back this time. I don't know how he did it, but he ended up in France. From Flemingville to France in the 1850s. And he apprenticed himself to a woman artist in Paris. Now, this artist was quite famous for encouraging young women to become artists. But she took a liking to Henry Cross, and she decided to take him under her wing, and she taught him painting too. Her name was Rosa Bonheur. I don't know anything about her other than that. She was a wonderful artist, famous for her paintings of animals. And Henry Cross loved painting animals. So, he became an outstanding animal painter. Well, he returned to America in 1856 and joined the circus again. This time he had a job. He was painting the circus wagons for Barnum and Bailey. Did all the animal paintings on the sides of the wagons and the cages and so on for the circus.
No wonder he got picked for presidential portraits.
What's that?
I said, no wonder he got picked for presidential portraits.
No, this is a different artist. That was Thomas LeClaire, this is Henry Cross.
Same circus.
And he traveled all over the country with the circus. and he heard about something that fascinated him. He got out west and he met Indians, and he was fascinated by Indians. And he got a special permit from Abraham Lincoln to paint Indian chiefs. A lot of the Indian chiefs were kind of like prisoners almost. A lot of them had been rounded up and sent to reservations. And so Henry Cross started painting Indian chiefs. And he was very good at it. This is one of them. He painted dozens and dozens and dozens of them. I'm going to leave these on the table for a while so that everybody, if you want to take a closer look at any of them, come up. And with all of these portraits, the portraits of Indian chiefs many of them are entire wings of museums in this country are devoted to Henry Cross's paintings of Indian chiefs. I think there's a museum in New Mexico. If I dug through all my notes here, I could probably find the name of the place that contains maybe 40 of his paintings of Indian chiefs. So they are there. The other passion, and he didn't make a lot of money painting the Indians, but he hired himself out to a couple of rich people who owned racehorses to do portraits of their horses for big bucks. So that's how he earned it. That was his day job. That's how he earned his living. But his passion was painting animals and Indian chiefs. By the way, he had a brother, Ferdinand, who was a sculptor and was as good at sculpting as Henry was at painting. But he didn't travel the world, and his stuff is not in museums because with sculpting, especially if you're doing it in nature at a rock formation, it kind of stays put. So his brother was quite a noted sculptor, but not as noted. Oh yeah, we mentioned Thomas Leclerc already. Well, that's him. Him we have a picture of. We don't. Henry Cross never did a self-portrait. There's no pictures of Henry Cross. He painted other people. No pictures of him. Leclerc, not very good and not much. And this is about it for Thomas Leclerc.
Which two presidents?
Benjamin Harrison, I think, was one of them, and Ulysses Grant. Okay, now we're going to jump to somebody fairly modern, and this we found out in 2018 down at the museum. We were honoring veterans, and we discovered that we had somebody in Tioga County that had a rather unique achievement, and that was Clarence Dickinson. Clarence Dickinson's father ran Dickinson and created Dickinson bus lines. That was the first big major bus line. It connected Owego, Elmira, Ithaca, and Binghamton, and ran all around between those places. Well, Clarence had some sons, and one of them's name was Clarence, spelled C-L-A-R-A-N-C-E, not E-N-C-E, and he was fussy about that. Boy, you misspell his name, and you were going to hear about it. So anyway, Clarence Dickinson, born and raised in Owego, his father, Leonard Dickinson, operated the bus line and a small air taxi service. At one time, there were several runways between Owego and Devil's Elbow Hill, going out that way. And Clarence learned to fly as a teenager. And by the time the 30s rolled around, he was a very good pilot. And in the 30s, of course, they started having problems in Europe. Things started to go bad as the Nazi organization built up, and Adolf Hitler was kind of trying to do his dirty work over there. And Clarence Dickinson wanted to be a fighter pilot. So he went down. Of course, there was no such thing as the United States Air Force. And the United States was not involved and did not want to be involved in anything that was going on in Europe at that point anyway. So Clarence was turned away by the U.S. military. He went up to Canada and joined the Canadian Air Force. They shipped him, and he earned his wings in the Canadian Air Force. They shipped him over to England. Over there, he joined the RAF and flew missions for them. He got his wings from the RAF. So now we had Canadian and British wings. Around this time, the United States gets involved in World War II. And so he left the British Royal Air Force to join, at this time, American air units were being assigned to Britain from the United States, and he joined the United States Air Force and got his third set of wings. He flew a whole bunch of combat missions for the United States and got to a point where the United States Air Force, well, still was no Air Force, it was still the Army Air Corps, said, look, Clarence, you are far too valuable for us to risk sending you continually into combat. We're going to send you down to North Africa where you are going to train other pilots for the French. So the French had all kinds of air bases in North Africa. He went down to North Africa, trained pilots there, and got his fourth set of wings. And we had his uniform on display in 2018 down at the museum as being the only man in American military history to have earned and have the right to wear the wings of 4 nations. Kind of cool.
Tom, my father was a friend of his. I knew him when I was real little. Clarence would be around with my father, and he, I think at that time he was a pilot for like TWA or something. Like eventually after the military, he got into flying commercial planes.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, he was the founder of the first regularly scheduled commercial airline between the Triple Cities and New York, which eventually kind of Robinson Airlines out of Ithaca beat him out of it. And then, of course, Robinson was absorbed by Mohawk, which was absorbed by Eastern, which was absorbed by United or American. In any case, the airline of the month eventually absorbed it all. But yes, he was the first commercial pilot to fly out of the Triple Cities after the war. All right. Am I going too long?
No.
Keep going.
All right. Well, don't be shy about saying, look, you know.
I got another hour on the tape.
Yeah. Well, this next guy that I'm going to talk about, he was noted because, I'll tell you, this guy would take crap from anybody. But the one product that most farmers won't stand behind, that was Joe Kemp, who invented the manure spreader. He didn't invent it in the United States. Joe Kemp invented it in Canada, but he couldn't make any money selling it up there because everybody looked and said, you gotta be kidding me. So he came to the United States and he built a factory in Syracuse to make manure spreaders. And before they could start manufacturing, the factory burned to the ground. So he had some family in the Newark Valley area that said, look, Joe, come down here, we'll fix you up. And they did. One of my favorite photographs, I have a postcard, and it's a real photo postcard of the building in Newark Valley that made the manure spreaders. And later on, some of you may remember it was the ladder factory later on. It's gone now, they tore it down about 2 years ago. But in any case, when Joe Kemp owned the building, on the side of it, in letters, probably 4 feet high, that building was about 200 feet long. And running the entire length of that building across, up above the second floor windows, there was a sign, lettering about 4 feet high, and there it was emblazoned right across that building from one end to the other. 20th century manure distribution. And of course, eventually, he was a cagey one. He'd make an adjustment in the patent, sell it to John Deere. Make an adjustment in the patent, sell it to Success. Another adjustment in the patent, sell it to New Century. Another adjustment in the patent, sell it to International Harvester. And so he had everybody making his manure spreaders. And eventually, the factory in Newark Valley was sold to International Harvester, which eventually they moved on to bigger situations and so on. But this is Joe Kemp with his first original manure spreader. I'll leave that somewhere around here.
Sam, can I jump back to Clarence 1 second? I remembered an interesting story. About 2 years ago, there was a remake of the movie Midway. And, you know, we remember the first one from, I don't know, back in the, whatever it was, 50s or something. But I watched the credits at the end of this more modern movie, and Clarence Dickinson's name was on there as a pilot.
Oh.
And I said, you know, because I peripherally knew him just a little bit through the eyes of a young child. So I sought out his, I think it's maybe his niece or something, lives in Owego on Page Street. Might be a daughter, I'm not sure, I don't remember.
He has a niece that lives in Owego, but still very active in the community.
Okay, yeah, that's probably the lady you're talking about. I know her son through sports and so forth. But
Yes.
anyway,
Yes.
let's see, so
The
she...
son still lives in Owego, which
Right.
would be the great nephew of Clarence.
Okay, well, maybe I'd like to talk to you more about that, because I remember Clarence being interesting. But maybe this, it just crossed my mind, maybe this is why he was so particular about how to spell his name, because she clarified to me that the Clarence Dickinson in the movie that was on the Midway aircraft carrier is not the Clarence that we know,
Yeah.
you know? And I'm wondering, since you brought, how did you get that point where you said he was persnickety about the A in his name?
From his niece,
Okay, I bet that was kind of related, because maybe other people used
Sue Dickinson. Well, it was Sue Palladino when she was married. But
Okay.
it's Sue Dickinson, again now, she goes back by, and yeah, I got a lot of great information from Sue about her father, who had the bus company, and her uncle.
Okay.
Well, not her father, her grandfather had the bus company, and her uncle.
Yeah, that was nice. She sat with me for a good period of time and talked about it, because I had that interest remembering Clarence from the old days. But I'd like-
Sue's son was one of my students in my early teaching days.
Joe.
Well,
Yes, yes.
Joe is much younger though, right? Because I was one of your students in your earlier teaching.
Yeah.
days. Joe was much younger, but you might have had him though. He was, I think he was a star like in maybe the 80s or.
Something like that, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. All righty. Oh, by the way, since you brought up the movie credit, I forgot. Does anybody remember the TV show Death Valley Days?
Yeah.
Okay. Toward the end of their run, there was an episode of Death Valley Days which was all about the woman from Spencer that became the elected official.
Oh, wow.
There was an episode about her, and I forgot to mention that. I'm getting old. Too much to remember, too many things. Okay, I gotta mention something about this gal. And again, not to forget the ladies. We got the ladies represented, well represented here. This gal, Helen Dean King, was a scientist, and she was very good. Unfortunately, what she did is a little bit on the controversial side now. Some of her activities would probably get some people, because she was a fabulous scientist and her work saved millions, tens of millions of lives. And that's because she invented the lab rat. This is the woman that bred a special species of rat, which somehow she ingrained into them enough human DNA that those rats were used for testing practically all medications that we take today. And a lot of the development of modern medicine was due to the fact that they had a way to test it without testing it on people. And that's because Helen Dean King developed the lab rat. At one time, there were only 2 women on planet Earth that really reached the level of scientific achievement that, and the other one was a woman, again, probably a name you've heard of, Madame Marie Curie. And these 2 were the only 2 women in the world that reached that level of scholarship. All righty. Now we're getting there. I'm probably going to skip a few, but I'll mention a couple more. This is one that's kind of intriguing. This guy was probably Owego Leonardo da Vinci. If I were to ask you, who invented the electric motor? I mean, everybody here owns probably a dozen electric motors. The guys have them in your shavers, the women have them in your refrigerators, your wash machines, your dryers, your dishwashers. They all have electric motors. Who invented the electric motor? No, it wasn't Thomas Edison.
Why?
Why?
The answer is, of course, nobody really knows, because there were a number of people that over the years contributed to the modern electric motor. But way back, before the Civil War in the 1850s, there was a guy from Owego whose name was John Hoyt Lilly that invented an electric motor and patented it in the year 1850. So he was not, we can't say he invented the electric motor. We can say he invented an electric motor. And he had to fight to get the patent of it, because somebody in the patent office was crooked and said, oh, yeah, I patented that. He got in a big fight over it, but he won. He went to court and he won, and he owns that patent. But anyway, John Lilly, his father was a school teacher in Owego. He has one of the first teachers at the academy in Owego. And so John was Isaac Lilly's first son. Actually born in Pennsylvania, but when his mother died and Dad moved up to Owego and took the job teaching in Owego, he was still a young kid. So he moved up here with his father, and he considered Owego his home off and on for the rest of his life. He didn't live here on a continuous basis, but he lived here a lot. And this guy, he was into everything. He, back way before Hiawatha Island, there were a couple of experimental steamboats on the Susquehanna from Owego. Well, John Lilly's was, interestingly enough, called the Lily, was the second steamboat on the Susquehanna. And it operated for a number of years. Then John decided he'd like to have a little adventure in his life, and he went out. 1834, he went to Chicago. Well, if you know anything about Chicago, you know that it didn't exist until 1833. And in 1833, Chicago was first settled. And in 1834, they wanted to establish a village, but they had to take a census first. So who left Owego and went out to Chicago to do the census of the brand new shiny little village of Chicago? John Lilly. He went out, thought this would be fun. I'm going to do that. I'm going out to Chicago and do the census. So he did. While he was traveling around, he ran into a doctor, a medical doctor, thought, that's interesting work. I'm going to apprentice with him for a while. I'm going to become a doctor. And he did. He got his medical license after apprenticing with a doctor somewhere out in the Midwest. Forget just where. He was also a watchmaker. He could build you a watch from whatever, I guess. He knew how to put one together, take it apart, put it back together again. And then in 1850, he patented his electric motor. Now, what he did to demonstrate his electric motor, he built an electric train. Probably the first electric train in history. And it was on a big, like 8-foot platform. And he demonstrated it here in Owego in 1851 at his house on Front Street. The house isn't there anymore. It was the first house next to William Street on Front Street. There's other houses there now, but not that one. So anyway, he gave a model of it. This is where he made a big mistake. He gave a model of his electric train to P.T. Barnum, who took it all over the country and displayed it and created a wonderful, a lot of people enjoyed seeing it and got a great deal of pleasure out of it and so on. There's only one problem. P.T. Barnum does not exactly have a reputation as being a pursuer of scholarly endeavors. People didn't take the electric train seriously. They thought, oh, it's a toy. Isn't that cute? And they didn't take it seriously. So unfortunately, that electric motor was considered a toy by an awful lot of people, and it did not get the scientific credit that it deserved. Although it really was about the first electric motor ever made. So, with all of this, he lived in a lot of places. He was in Hornellsville, Rochester, Chicago, San Francisco. While he was out in San Francisco, that was during one of the big World's Fairs. And he became quite a hit out there because he transported people. This was at a time when transporting people from the West Coast to the East Coast was no mean feat. This was a big deal. And he arranged excursions to bring people to the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. So that was one of his big adventures. He traveled in Europe, he lived in Philadelphia, he lived in Cincinnati, he lived in Peoria, but he always considered Owego his home, and he always came back to Owego. Okay. That was somebody you hadn't heard of before, isn't it? Got you on that one anyway, finally. Oh, well, we'll skip some of these guys. Oh, here we go. This is something completely different. Anybody here read the comic strips in paper? Oh, good. I'm glad to see a few hands. Everybody here familiar with Blondie and Dagwood? I think everybody's probably heard of Blondie and Dagwood. What isn't real well known is the guy that created Blondie and Dagwood is dead now. His son still writes some of the stories, but there's somebody else that does all the drawing. There's a cartoonist that draws Blondie and Dagwood now. So seamlessly, you can't see the difference. If you go back and look at Blondie and Dagwood 50 years ago and Blondie and Dagwood in 2022, it's pretty seamless. But the comic strip Blondie and Dagwood is now drawn by a man named John Marshall. John Marshall, born and raised in Waverly, New York, Tioga County. He lives in Binghamton now and still draws the comic strip, but that comic strip now comes out of Binghamton. And John Marshall draws Blondie and Dagwood. So that's something you didn't know about somebody you hadn't heard of before. How about Dan McCallum? Name Dan McCallum ring a bell with anybody? We'll find out who reads the Courier now, because I wrote about Dan McCallum a couple of months ago in the Courier. Everybody here has probably heard the names Ben Tracy and Isaac Catlin, who reached the level of brevet general during the Civil War. But one of the most significant and important generals of the Civil War was also from here in Owego. He wasn't born or raised here, but he lived here for a major portion of his life. Dan McCallum came to Owego during the construction of the Erie Railroad. Dan McCallum was a bridge designer, and he and another fellow by the name of Bristol designed all of the bridges for the Erie Railroad. And of course, the Erie Railroad, at the time it was planned and constructed, was the longest railroad on planet Earth. It crossed the entire state from the Hudson River to Lake Erie. As a matter of fact, that was the original name of the Erie Railroad was the Hudson River and Lake Erie Railroad, as it connected those two bodies of water. So, Dan McCallum not only built an awful lot of the Erie, but he was civil engineer, not trained locomotive engineer. But he did an awful lot of the design and construction, and he was so successful that eventually he became the foreman, equivalent to the chief operating officer today of a corporation. And he reached the highest level. He ran the Erie Railroad for a while. Unfortunately, he was too persnickety. He was pretty fussy. He wanted things done his way, and the Erie ended up firing him. But another little accomplishment of Dan McCallum, and we're not anywhere near done with Dan yet, but another accomplishment of his, who invented the organizational chart? You know, corporations where they've got the president and then they've got all the boxes and the lines and all that. You know, it's one of those things everybody kind of takes for granted. Yeah, that's been around forever. No, it hasn't been around forever. Dan McCallum invented it. He is the first one to ever do an organizational chart. And he did the original one he did was for the Erie Railroad. He did it while he was living at 50-something Front Street in downtown Owego. The house is still there in this case. So that was another little thing that Dan McCallum did. But the thing for which he is most noteworthy, during the Civil War, probably the most significant achievement during the Civil War was maintaining the railroads, because this was how the North won the war. We had the supply routes. We had railroads all over the North. One of the things that we successfully did was prevent the South from building railroads and keeping theirs from running around very much. But the North supplied all of our troops and moved our troops with railroads. And there were places where the South got in there and they ripped up the tracks and everything. And Dan McCallum, it was his job to get that railroad rebuilt today, if not yesterday. And he did. He successfully laid 10,000 miles of track while he was working for the Union Army. And that was an amazing accomplishment during a war. But he kept those trains running and kept supply lines open. So that was Dan McCallum's big thing, his final big act. It was Dan McCallum who created Abraham Lincoln's funeral train. He had a special car built for the funeral car and designed the route and developed it to take Lincoln back to his tomb in Illinois. But good old Dan, unfortunately, one of the sad stories about Dan, when he passed away, well, he just right after the Civil War, he came back to Owego. This was his home. And he built a brand new mansion. He had a beautiful home on Front Street, but he built a mansion on Glenmary Drive right next to his buddy Bristol, who was also a civil engineer. And Bristol's house is still there. It's the Glenmary Home or Glenmary Inn, now bed and breakfast. And right next to it, Dan McCallum built a fabulous mansion. And then he was on a trip to New York City, and while he was in New York City, the place burned to the ground. And so all Dan had left was a trunk. For whatever reason, it was believed that he was penniless, But everything he had was in that trunk, and they opened the trunk and saw clothes, and they just closed it again. And it was probably 20 years after he died. By that time, even his daughter, his only relative, had died. So he had no living relatives. Finally, somebody, and I think the trunk by this time had found its way somewhere down, I think, into the Carolinas. How that happened, I don't know. But in any case, somebody finally opened that trunk and went down and found over $100,000 worth of negotiable bonds in the bottom of that trunk that nobody got the benefit of because nobody knew they were there. So if your family members die, open their trunk. So, all righty, well, one or two more and we'll wrap it up. I hate to keep bringing up Waverly, but this is another guy from Waverly, George Pierce. And he was not born in Waverly, but he moved up there as a very young man, went through the entire Waverly school system and graduated from Waverly High School or Academy or whatever. And you'll see information about George if you visit our automobile museum down, our automobile exhibit at the museum down in Owego, because George Pierce eventually moved up to Buffalo and he got into manufacturing and he made baby buggies and bicycles. Around 1902 or so, he decided, you know, let's get into this new thing here. Let's see if we can build a car. And he was, again, he was one of these sticklers. He wanted everything to be just perfect. And eventually, the car that he built, he called it the Arrow. Yep, they didn't, well, it was the Arrow made by the Pierce Company for a while, and eventually, yes, it became the Pierce Arrow. For a while, it was even the Pierce Great Arrow, because George was pretty confident in it. He was so confident of it that it was christened the American Rolls Royce. It was that good a car. But started with a local boy from down in Waverly. All right, we'll mention one more. And we'll end with a cute girl. Seems interesting. Well, this is Elaine Sullivan. And her address was 36 Main Street, Owego, New York. That, for your information, is not a house anymore. It's the driveway to go up to Price Chopper. But that's where she was. She was from the poor part of town, Kanawani, and even then, her house was surrounded by tobacco fields, because that was pretty much what Kanawani was in those days. So the fairgrounds was across the street, and the fairgrounds wasn't a fairgrounds when she was a girl growing up, it was a tobacco field. So she was pretty, and she was talented. And in 1900, she decided to seek fame and fortune as a star. Well, of course, 1900, there was no such thing as movies. There was no such thing as television. There wasn't even any such thing as radio or movies yet. There were no movies that early. So the capital of entertainment in the United States was Broadway. She went to Broadway and she was an immediate success. She starred in a whole bunch of different plays that were performed down there and became involved in what was then the longest production in Broadway history. It has been surpassed maybe in the last few years. I think Cats was the first play to finally surpass it. But it was Florodora was the name of the play, and she was a Florodora girl. These were the 6 most beautiful women in America, so the company tried to advertise. And the audience every night was filled with bachelors, hoping to get to meet one of the Florodora girls. And she did eventually marry one of them. She had been married when she lived in Owego. interestingly, and I guess appropriately enough, when she lived in Owego and was married here briefly, her husband's name was Jimmy Durant. And I gather a lot of people thought he was the rat. So when she left him that she went to New York City to find fame and fortune. She modeled for cosmetic companies, for billboards and things like that. She was in every performance of Florodora. When she started, she was not a Florodora girl, she was in the chorus, but those girls got married off and left fairly frequently. And she very quickly, within the first year, she became a Florodora girl, and she was in every performance. They had something like close to 600 performances. She was in every one of them. And so that was not her only claim to fame. She eventually was one of the original, who were the ones that became so famous down there?
Rockets.
No, way before the Rockettes. Way before the Rockettes. Ziegfeld, yes. She appeared in the original, the first Ziegfeld Follies, around 1907. Unfortunately, she was not healthy, and she died young. She was only 39. She died before she turned 40. And came back to Owego to have her mother take care of her because she was not in good health. And she died. She's buried in an unmarked grave in the Tioga Cemetery. And her mother is also buried there, and again, it's unmarked. The only name on the grave is her grandfather because the plot was big enough. So, something you may not know, and I think it's probably enough for one night.
One more.
Hey, Tom, can I go back to the tobacco thing for a second? So the Kanawani and the fairgrounds, and I think I've seen on the Tioga State Bank has historical pictures every year on their calendar.
Yep.
I think I've seen over by the Elm Street School. So all that was tobacco fields.
Well, at one time, it was like 3,000 acres of tobacco in the village of Owego. It extended from Kanawani across Main Street, through the fairgrounds, through all the school grounds, right on up, through most of the flats, and
Wow.
where the present high school and middle school are now today, and the Owego Elementary School, all the way up probably to, you get close to Turner's Bridge. That was all tobacco field. I think there were a lot of acres there.
Was that all?
At one time, and it was cigar tobacco.
Okay.
A fact that isn't real well known, not Cuba, but Binghamton was considered the cigar-making capital of the world.
Yeah.
And Owego, as unfortunately it's often considered today, was part of the greater Binghamton area. But they were making cigars here. The first cigar factory in Tioga County was not in Owego, it was in Richford.
Okay.
But they grew tobacco all over the place. And when you consider the entire southern tier, at one time there were probably at least 30,000 acres of tobacco.
So in the Owego area that you described, was that all Pompelli? Did he own all
That was most of it, yeah. It wasn't all Pompelli, but a lot of it was, yeah.
And then he kind of ended up contributing the land that became the fairgrounds and stuff, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Actually, a fellow by the name of Marvin did a lot of the donating of the land to the village. He bought a lot of that land.
Okay.
Marvin Park, yep, yep, sure.
My family, my grandfather Lawrence Howe and his brother owned that
Yes,
between,
yes, they did.
but the fairgrounds was there when I was growing up, so it was just tobacco
Yeah,
and
well,
corn.
the land between Main Street and along Owego Creek down to the Susquehanna River, the area that we call Kanawani,
Right.
they were growing tobacco even there. Along between William Street and Owego Creek, that area was all
Yeah.
tobacco.
It was when I was.
Yep. The former mayor of Owego was trying to, with the help of Rotary or Kiwanis, I'm not sure, is trying to develop that area as a natural preserve down there. They're doing pretty well with it. They're really come a long way in restoring that to nature down in there. You can still tell where the old canal was that went through, because of course there were mills and stuff there. I'm working on what started off to be an article that I think is now going to be a series. And I was going to have it done a week ago, and now it's going to take me at the rate I'm going a couple more weeks. Called Spinning Wheel Space Shuttle, The History of Manufacturing in Tioga County. You wouldn't believe the stuff that was made here. I mean, we've talked about the folding chair and the manure spreader, and of course the space shuttle computers. That doesn't even scratch the surface. They made every blooming thing in Tioga County.
When you gonna have that talk ready?
I'm still writing the article. I think it's probably going to be at least a 3-part article, maybe more. We'll see how ambitious I am. So far, as I said, I started Spinning Wheel to Space Shuttle, and I'm still in the 1800s. For one thing, at one time, we had more working silversmiths turning out tableware in Owego than they had in Ithaca, Elmira, and Binghamton added together, cranking out silver. And a few years back, I wrote an article about where all that silver came from. And of course, also, we made clocks. Even Candor had a clockmaker in the 1840s. So there were clockmakers all over the county, and that's going to be part of this article.
How big was Ogden Brothers?
Ogden Brothers, there's something I found out not too long ago about the Ogden Brothers. They were wonderful gunsmiths. They were fabulous. They made some of the best guns, period. And a friend of mine a few years back was traveling out west, and he visited the Mountain Man Museum. I think it's somewhere out in the Rockies. And of course, the most famous mountain man of all time was Jim Bridger. He's pretty well known in those circles. And there is a museum, the Mountain Man Museum, focused on Jim Bridger. When you walk in the main door, in the lobby, right there behind the desk, when you go in, is a rifle hanging on the wall. Jim Bridger's most favorite rifle. Ogden Brothers, Owego, New York. It's amazing because stuff that was made here has been found all over the country. They have found Farnham spinning wheels out in the Midwest, all over the country. Champion wagons have been found all over the country. As a matter of fact, that was, everybody talks about the Conestoga wagon. Well, yeah, the Conestoga wagon was pretty popular, pretty well known, but an awful lot of people went west on champion wagons.
Now that farm spinning wheel, that one by Turner's Bridge up to the left there, that farm back in there?
Way up behind Metros.
Yeah.
Yes, the mill was up there on the banks of Owego Creek.
Okay.
Yep, about maybe a half mile
Yeah.
above Route 96. There's not much of it left now. A little bit of the stone foundation. That's about all that's there.
Some barns there a long time ago, I remember. There's still some barns.
Yeah, the barn's in rough shape, but it's still there. The Kwiatkowskis
Own it, own it.
They own that, okay.
yeah.
Is that the old Sination place you're talking about? Is that the Sination place that you're talking about?
Yes, up behind Metros, yeah. Yeah, Metros, it's Metro Road, but when you go out there, there's a house out there and a barn and what is left of a couple of cabins and the mill. But that was, Farnham's owned a lot of land because I lived in Catatonk a couple of miles past there and our land was Farnham land. When Rick Farnham came up from Florida, he's one of the last descendants with the Farnham name. He lives down in Titusville near Cape Kennedy, and he visited us a few years back. And he and I and the people from the museum got Henry to take us through and show us, Henry Kwiatkowski, show us that whole area out there where the farms had been. But we were contacted because our land that we owned was farmland too, even though we're a couple miles past that area, we still owned farm land. And as a result, I had to go out and I've got a farm flax wheel, a farm wool wheel, and a farm yarn winder. One thing about Farnham, they're not rare, they're everywhere around here. And they signed everything they made, they put their name on it. So there's no mistaking it. If it doesn't say Farnham on it, Farnham didn't make it. If Farnham made it, their name is on it. They signed everything. A lot of different signatures, there's Farnham, Joel Farnham, Farnham and Son, but it's all Farnham, it's all the same family. Anybody else have any
What type of equipment is that you're talking about?
spinning wheels?
Okay.
Tom, I heard that the guy that set up Robert's Rules of Order,
Absolutely.
he was from here?
Henry Martin Robert. He was another Civil War general, but he wasn't a combat general, he was a civil engineer general, and he was very famous. This man had multiple careers. He was a civil engineer. He was the one that built the original flood wall for the Galveston Harbor. He designed it. That was one of his big achievements. But being in the military, he was stuck going to an awful lot of meetings. Drove him up the wall. So he decided, I can't stand this anymore. We've got to establish some ground rules for meetings. And this is where Robert's Rules of Order come from. And he moved here a little bit later in life. But it was Owegos where he wrote Robert's Rules of Order. Actually, the correct title of the book is Robert's Rules of Order Revised. And it was written here in Owego, and he owned 3 different properties at various times. He lived here a long time. He was married here, and he had a daughter here. And I'm not sure who she married, but yes, that's another name that I didn't mention tonight because I figured everybody's heard of Robert's Rules, and everybody knows, but maybe you didn't know he lived in Owego for probably half of his life.
Another one, Washington Gladden.
Yes, everybody, that's a good one, because for years I asked the question, who the heck is Washington Gladden? Why did they name a school after him? Why is that the only school in Owego that's named after a person? None of the other ones are. So Washington Gladden, the reason they named a school after him is because he taught school in a little one-room schoolhouse, and he went to school in a little one-room schoolhouse. That's still standing, by the way. That's at the foot of that hill as you head toward Endicott. The school that he taught in, it's people live in it now, it's a house. But it was originally built as a schoolhouse, and it's still standing.
Is that the one on Bodle Hill?
It was not on Bodle Hill, it's past there, it's on the road that goes over Day Hollow.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, Day Hollow. Yeah, that's it, it's on that road. But they named the Washington Gladden for him because that was basically similar location, not far. And he of course became the head of the Congregational Church. He's a congregational preacher, but not just a congregational church preacher. He was the national head.
He wrote the hymn, "Oh Master, Let Me Walk With Thee."
Yes, he did. He wrote hymns as well. And there's a great story about him and John D. Rockefeller. John D., of course, was actually quite a philanthropist. And he gave away, he was the first guy in the country to earn $1 billion, and he gave half of it away. During his lifetime, $500 million he gave away. So there were some people who didn't like him very well.
To say the least.
Yeah. Among them, I think Henry Ford wasn't fond of him. Nor were the farmers who couldn't sell their corn for alcohol. But there were some people that decided they were going to pull a little stunt. And since John D. Rockefeller and Washington Gladden were both from the same little town here, they decided, well, we're going to set this up. And they asked John D. to make a donation to Washington Gladden for the Congregational Church. And John D. did. He wrote out a check. I have no idea how much it was for. A couple $1,000, I guess. And there was going to be this big ceremony where John D. was going to hand the check to Washington Gladden. And the ceremony got started, and these guys, the deacons or whatever, came up and rushed up and grabbed the check and said, "We don't want your filthy lucre going, you know, God has no use for your filthy money," and they tore the check up and threw it back at Rockefeller. And that supposedly is a true story that really happened. It's kind of quiet. But they refused to accept a donation.
Well, thank you, Tom. I think if anyone has more questions.
Yeah, I'm willing, but I think as I said, I think you guys want to get home before the weekend.
Thank you very much.
I hope it didn't go too long.
Oh, no. Very good.
You waiting for
I
Emma to
expected some
retire?
people to say, well, I could have stopped a little sooner.
Tom, you waiting for Emma to retire? You've got a lot of knowledge there to give to the community.
Yeah,
Emma's still.
all right.
He's so good.